Hey everyone, welcome back to Reading with Tatiana. Today I'm doing my book review on The House on the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune, and I gave this book a 5 out of 5. Before I get into my full review, I would like to do my booktuber shout today to Jessica Donegan. I'll link her channel down below. She does a lot of reviews on fantasy and romance, and she just recently celebrated her 1-year anniversary on BookTube. So show her some love and welcome, and I'll link her channel again down below. As always, if you enjoy my content, I'll appreciate if you hit the subscribe button, if you give this video a thumbs up, and if you read this book yourself, I would love to hear what you thought in the comments down below. A bit about the author TJ Klune. He is a Oregon-born resident, Pacific Northwest represent, and he started writing as young as 8 years old, starting in fan fiction, and he was also very supported by his teachers. Obviously, he is an American author and he identifies as queer, and he thinks it's really important to share his lived experiences in asexuality, queerness, and neurodiversity, and he believes there should be more stories and books about all these topics and experiences, and that's what he writes a lot about. He has written many books, a lot of them are series or two-parters, and he has a bunch of standalones as well. This book, The House on the Cerulean Sea, if you're interested in checking TJ Klune's work, is a standalone novel, so if you want to start with this one, I would highly recommend it. This book was published in 2020, and the genre for my library says it's science fiction, as you can see here. However, I personally think it's more of a fantasy, just because of the magical creatures, but I guess it is kind of grounded in science fiction because in the book there is reality that we know it as humans as well. So I guess it's science fiction, but I would also call it hybrid with fantasy. A bit about the book. So one thing I learned about this book that was very interesting was TJ Klune was inspired, even though he's American, by the 60s scoop that happened in Canada and our indigenous population. So to give a background what that was, it was when during the 60s that our Canadian government deemed that it was necessary for a lot of indigenous children to be brought to residential schools away from their parents because they weren't safe in their homes. I actually did a book review earlier this year, which I'll link down below, called Five Little Indians by Michelle Good. If you want to read more about accurate experiences and realistic experiences of children that went to residential schools and the impact it had on them in their adult life. I do want to preface that I will talk more about TJ Klune's inspiration by the 60s scoops and the indigenous residential schools in Canada. I will talk about that more in my Goodreads rating review section of my video. How the story starts in The House on the Cerulean Sea is we meet Linus Baker. He is 40 years old, he has a cat, he's a bit overweight, he has a very routine life and no excitement, and that is a picture that TJ Klune paints of Linus Baker, our main protagonist. And he also works for the department in charge of magical youth, or DICME for short, and he is a caseworker. So basically his job is he goes to different orphanages of magical youths. He inspects them and deems them if they're safe or if they're not safe to continue to operate. And he's just a caseworker, so he has no idea what happens to these youths after his reports, and he doesn't care because he just follows a handbook of rules and regulations. One day, Linus Baker, he is sent to a level 4 case by the extremely upper management to an island which is in the Cerulean Sea, as the title of the book is called, and there he is meant to report honestly about what's happening there. And here he meets 6 magical youths of different backgrounds, and he also meets the master of this orphanage. And I don't want to go into too many details, but it's really cool because this book really made me think of Harry Potter and just all this new magical creatures. And so Linus Baker, he kind of, without spoiling it, has all these preconceived notions broken down, and he becomes more spontaneous and more creative, and it's really cool to see his changes as he meets and interacts with these 6 magical youths. Some of the 6 creatures or children that we deal with are familiar magical creatures such as gnomes and sprites. And I really appreciate that TJ Klune also made up some creatures that are not, I guess, cemented in fantasy or science fiction that we know of. So it's cool that he did a mix of known magical creatures and also ones that he made up himself. Common themes or lessons I learned. One quote I want to share is, "Hate is loud, but I think you'll learn it's because it's only a few people shouting desperate to be heard. You might never be able to change your minds, but so long as you remember you're not alone, you will overcome." So I really enjoyed that quote because the book talks a lot about the villagers near the orphanage that have a lot of hatred for the six magical youths or the children. And it's kind of crazy because these are just kids. They don't know any better, they didn't choose their magical abilities, and they need a safe place to be able to harness their powers. And these villagers really hate these kids and they kind of want to even really hurt them. So I really like that quote because I feel that applies to a lot of society that I live in right now, especially with the pandemic and a lot of discrimination that happens in North America and around the world. So that was a quote that really stuck with me, and that was a very prevalent thing that you see throughout this book about discrimination, about mistreatment of others, about not understanding. So that's a very common lesson I learned through this book that I really enjoyed, and it was very surprising considering it was a fantasy. A other common lesson a female learned, especially with Linus Baker, our protagonist, as I mentioned earlier, that he goes through a lot of changes and metamorphosis of sorts, is that, it's easy to fall into a routine and a cycle of no excitement in your life, which is fine if that's what you want, but it's very clear that Linus has a very unfulfilled life, and it's important to live for yourself and not be scared to feel your emotions. So I thought that was a really great lesson to learn as well. I gave this book a 5 out of 5, so there wasn't a lot of things I didn't like about this book. This is a personal preference for mine, and if you watch all my reviews, it's a very common thing I don't like in books, is that there was a romance in this book where I don't think it was needed to really carry the plot or for character development, and I think it could have gone without. So that was one thing I didn't like, because for me it felt very forced. Things I did like about this book I already touched on is I love the 6 children of this orphanage and their different abilities and how they interacted and how they had different insecurities that Linus managed throughout the story. Other things I like is Linus's transformation as a person and the way he sees his life and the way he views his life as well. And the last thing that I also mentioned in my lessons learned is I really enjoyed all the conflicts that happened between the orphanage and the villagers, and how it's a reflection of our reality as well. So it's, even though it is a made up world and these monsters or creatures aren't real, they still have this impact of discrimination on them. The Goodreads rating for this book, The House on the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune, got an average of 4.45 out of 5, which is very good in my books. This was a very enjoyable read, and I think because it came out during the pandemic, it also was a form of escapism for a lot of people. Usually I start with the bad reviews first, but I actually want to start with the good ones today because I want to talk a bit more about the bad reviews that I read that I was actually quite surprised by. So reasons why people love this book was what I mentioned earlier. They love the escapism from reality. They love the whimsical fantasy universe. It was very immersive. All the characters, even though there were 6 kids and a few adults, including Linus Baker, they were all very fleshed out. At no point of the book did it feel like a drag, and it felt like a very good standalone novel. So those are all really good reviews that people had about this novel. Some really bad reviews about this book that I want to share that I touched on earlier was, and I'm glad I read it because it really shows how there's different perspectives and the way to perceive things, and I'm really humbled by reading these 1-star reviews. So as I said earlier, TJ Klune was inspired by the 60 Scoops, where Indigenous kids were pulled from their homes to move into residential schools that were run by churches by the Canadian government in the 1960s. And I thought, hey, that's cool that TJ Klune did that, was inspired, and kind of wanted to spread that message. However, a lot of bad reviews said that he is profiting off this dark history as a Caucasian man, and also it's not really his story to tell. And a lot of people said that in a lot of ways, because in this book everything kind of comes together very neatly and happy, that he is taken away from the trauma that children went through in the real Indigenous residential schools, and also it's glorifying all this pain that people went through. So that's something that I thought was very interesting and something that I never would have thought of when reading the book. So that was really, I guess, humbling for me to learn those different perspectives. I acknowledge this isn't my place to share my opinions, but I can always share resources. So I'm going to link a organization down below. It is the Indigenous Residential Schools, I think, Survival Scholarship or fund like that, and I've donated to them in the past regularly, so I'll link them down below if you have the ability to donate as well to support these survivors. Why I think you should read this book. I think you should read it if you are a Harry Potter fan, because it's a new world of fantasy, new creatures. The children are the age range, maybe a bit younger than Harry Potter when he went to Hogwarts, but it's a new world to discover. I really enjoyed that. If you like about learning about people's metamorphoses, like Linus Baker changing from like black to white, also great as well. One of my favorite things to ask people when they have finished a book is to ask them how it made them feel, because if you had asked me tomorrow, a week, a month, a year from now, I'll never remember exactly what other characters were or what the plots were, but I'll also remember how a book made me feel. So this book, The House on the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, at the end of it, it made me feel very warm. It was a great story. You mean, when you read about an orphanage and how people overcome their insecurities or trauma, it's always very heartwarming. And this book has a happy ending, so it made me feel very warm, and that's why I gave it a 5 out of 5. If you read this book, The House on the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, I'd love to hear what you thought in the comments down below. And if you want to join me for my next book, I just started The Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulley, and it's also about Indigenous girl, I think coming of age, maybe a young adult novel. So far it's pretty good, and if you want to join me, I will see you at my next review. Thank you for watching until the end of this channel. If you like my content, please subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!